Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Aleph, Daf 31 of Masechta Sukkah. Daf 31 is cool. It talks about stolen sukkahs, which is kind of interesting. When you steal the whole sukkah, when you steal materials, components of the sukkah, we talk about the obligation of hodr, of having a beautiful lulav, of having a beautiful esrog. And then we see some other assorted halachas of esrog towards the end, and finishing off with some avodah zarah oriented things. So, cool daf. Let's get started. Daf Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph. 2 lines into the page. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Sukkah Gizula, a stolen sukkah. And a fellow who puts up schach in Rosh Hashanah. I assume it essentially means that he makes a sukkah in Rosh Hashanah. Okay? Rabbi Eliezer posel, v'chacham machshirin. Rabbi Eliezer says, possible, no good. And chacham say, kosher. Rav Nachman says of Nachman, machlokas b'shetokef es chaver v'otzio misukaso. Aha. So Rav Nachman says, what's the metzias over here? What are we talking about? We're talking about where Ruvain goes over to Shimon. Shimon built a beautiful sukkah. Ruvain decides that he wants to chop it. So he goes to Shimon's beautiful sukkah, throws out Shimon from the sukkah, and moves in. So he steals the sukkah in that way. Says Rav Nachman, that's what the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is talking about. When Ruvain goes over to Shimon, throws Shimon out of his sukkah, and hijacks it. Rabbi Eliezer the Taime, and Rabbi Eliezer is consistent with his reasoning, which is, Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, as we learned the other day, is that you're not allowed to eat in your friend's sukkah. Right? It says, what is it? You have to make licha for yourself, a sukkah. So it has to be yours. You cannot use your friend's sukkah. Now, ikar can exeles. So if property, karka, land, real estate, land, is able to be stolen. Now, your sukkah is considered karka. It's considered land because it's built on the land. So if we say that land is able to be, right, as Rashi points out on the last of the wide lines of Rashi, anything connected to the ground is considered like the ground, and therefore, since your sukkah is connected to the ground, it's built on the ground, so therefore it's considered karka. So if we say karka nigzeles, if it's possible to steal land, if the halacha is that it's possible to steal land, and therefore when Ruvain hijacks Shimon's sukkah, he's stealing the sukkah, well then sukkah gzulahi. Well then it's a stolen sukkah, and everyone agrees that a stolen sukkah is no good. V'inami, karka enin exelis, sukkah she'ulahi. And if we say that land is unable to be stolen, and therefore when Ruvain kicks Shimon out of his sukkah, technically speaking, he's not stealing Shimon's sukkah because Shimon's sukkah is considered land, and land is impossible to be stolen. But then that means that essentially Ruvain is borrowing Shimon's sukkah. For Rabbanan, and Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is that you're not allowed to use a borrowed sukkah. So he says, Mimon afshach. Either way you look at it, if it's stolen, you're using a stolen sukkah. If it's borrowed, you're using a borrowed sukkah. Both of them are unacceptable according to Rabbi Eliezer. For Rabbanan the Tamayu, the rabbis who say it's kosher, they are consistent with their reasoning. Because the rabbi's opinion is that a fellow is able to satisfy his obligation of sukkah in his friend's sukkah. V'karka einin exelis, and additionally, land is unable to be stolen, which means that when Ruvain throws Shimon out of his sukkah, in effect, halachically speaking, he's borrowing Shimon's sukkah. So v'sukkah she'ulahi, and it is a borrowed sukkah, and borrowed sukkahs are kosher at the end of the day, and therefore the rabbis say that when Reuven kicks Shimon out of his sukkah, in effect he's forcefully borrowing Shimon's sukkah, and technically speaking he's yotzei the mitzvah. Aval, but gozal eitzim, if Reuven steals some wood, and he built them into his sukkah, everyone agrees that in that case, you only have to pay back the value of the wood. And that's what's called takana sashavim, the takana of repenters. That, if Reuven steals some wood and he builds it into a sukkah, or in other cases he builds it into a building, and, if we would force you to destroy the entire building, or in this case the entire sukkah, in order to return that piece of wood, Reuven is not going to be inclined to do tshuva. So because we want to be supportive of Reuven repenting, so we say, look, you don't have to destroy your entire sukkah, just pay back the value of the wood that you stole. Right? So gozal eitzim v'sikech boen. So if he stole wood and he built them into a sukkah, he just needs to pay the value of the wood. He doesn't have to knock down the sukkah in order to return that piece of wood. Mimai. Now, how do we know that the Brisa is talking about, like Rav Nachman says, that Reuven throws Shimon out of his sukkah and hijacks his sukkah? Because the Brisa says that we juxtapose a stolen sukkah with the sukkah in a public domain. Just like when it comes to a Rishus Harabim, a public domain, we're talking about property that doesn't belong to him. So therefore also, we're talking about a sukkah that is similar, i.e. when Reuven goes to Shimon's property and kicks him out of his sukkah. Okay. Reuven goes to Shimon's property and kicks him out of his sukkah. There was a certain savta, grandmother, I guess a woman essentially, who came before Rav Nachman. She said to him, and she alleged to Rav Nachman that the Reish Gelusa and all of the rabbis by the Reish Gelusa, the exilarch, are sitting in a stolen sukkah, that they stole wood from me, and they're sitting in a stolen sukkah. I want my wood back. Destroy the sukkah. I want my wood back. Rav Nachman. And she was yelling and screaming, and Rav Nachman wasn't really paying much attention. She said to him, a woman whose grandfather had 318 servants, a reference to Avraham Avinu, that it says that he had, that he had 318 servants when he went to fight Stone. Well, the 5 kings. This woman whose grandfather, Avraham Avinu, had 318 servants, and you're not going to pay any attention? Rav Nachman said to him, Pa'isa hida, look, she's just making a lot of noise, but, you don't need she's just yelling and screaming. The fact of the matter is, she's only entitled to the value of the wood that was stolen. You do not need, they don't need to destroy the sukkah in order to give her back the actual wood. Rather, she just gets whatever the value of the wood that was taken is. I imagine that the Reish Gelusa's sukkah is probably very fancy. It'd probably be very, to destroy the entire sukkah to return those, to return the wood, maybe a big headache. But regardless of that, the halacha is that if wood was stolen and built into a structure, so you don't destroy the structure in order to return the wood, rather you return the value of the wood. Ravina says, Ravina, Haikshur de matlalta digzula, if you have a beam in a sukkah and the beam was stolen, Avdei Rabbana takantim shum takanos morish. So the rabbis made a takana, a gzera, to say, because of takanos morish, which if I understand correctly is the same thing as takanos hashavim, which is that you don't destroy the sukkah in order to return the beam. Pshita, this is obvious. Ma'ishna be'etzim, why should this be any different than the wood that we mentioned in the brisa, that you would just return the value of the wood? I might think, well, wood is very common. You can find wood anywhere. And therefore we say, look, just give this person money, and they could take the money, they could find other wood. But this beam is maybe less common, and maybe it's not as easy to just buy with money. So emalo, so I might think that you might actually have to destroy the sukkah in order to return the beam, kamash malan. So therefore, Ravina is teaching that, even this beam, you just give the value of the beam. Hanimile bego shiva, and this is only during sukkahs that you don't have to destroy the sukkah. Avalavasa shiva, but after sukkahs, well then hadar be'ene, dismantle the sukkah, because you don't need it for the mitzvah anymore. Dismantle the sukkah and return the beam. V'yichibro betina, and if you place the beam in the sukkah with like cement, well then afilu lacha shiva nami yoevle dmei, then even after sukkahs, you would just give the value of it if it's like cemented into the sukkah. Okay, that kind of concludes this part of today's daf, which is about stolen sukkahs, right? So we saw that if Reuven hijacks Shimon's sukkah from Shimon's property, so then we saw machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chacham. Rabbi Eliezer says that it's not an okay sukkah. The Chacham say it's an okay sukkah, and we also learned that if you would, steal materials such as wood or a beam and build it into your sukkah, so because of takonas hashavim, we would say you don't have to destroy the sukkah, rather you just give the value of the beam or the wood that was stolen. Now we get a shtickle into hadar, the mitzvah of having beautiful mitzvahs in the context of, I guess, hidur mitzvah in the context of lulav, and in the context of esrig tana. We learn in a brisa, Yavesh pasul, Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Okay. A dried out something is pasul. Rabbi Yehuda says that this dried out something is kosher. Now, what's this something? Rav machlokas belulav. Rav says we're talking about a lulav over here. And the Chachamim say a lulav ayavesh is pasul, and Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. Lulav le'esrig, because the rabbis say, well, we compare lulav to esrig. My esrig by hadar, aflulav by hadar. Just like esrig, right? It says pre-eitz hadar in the context of esrig. So of course esrig needs to be hadar, needs to be beautiful. But it says pre-eitz hadar v'kapos tamar. We compare, right? Meaning juxtaposed in the pasuk are the esrig as well as the lulav. So the Chacham say, look, we compare the lulav to the esrig, just like the esrig. It says hadar, it has to be beautiful. So the lulav has to be beautiful. And if it is dried out, it's not beautiful and it's not acceptable. For Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that we do not compare the lulav to the esrig. And while the esrig needs to be beautiful, the lulav does not need to be beautiful. And if it's dried out, it's still kosher. But when it comes to the esrig, everyone agrees, it says pre-eitz hadar, it has to be a beautiful esrig. One second, is this really true? The Rabbi Yehuda says that when it comes to lulav, it does not need to be hadar. The lulav does not need to be beautiful. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that you have to tie the lulav at the top, right? You have to make sure that it looks good, that it's not, the leaves aren't like spread out in different places. You have to tie it up. My time, is it not because Rabbi Yehuda requires that the lulav has to be beautiful, and therefore we want to tie it up so that everything is uniform? No, that's not why Rabbi Yehuda requires tying it up. It's as the reason is Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishum Reb Tarfin. The Rabbi Yehuda is quoting Reb Tarfin. Kapos Tamarim. The pasuk says Kapos Tamarim, which is a reference to the lulav kofus, and the drasha is that it has to be tied up. And if it was separated, so then you should tie it up. So we want to say that Rabbi Yehuda says that when it comes to lulav, you do not require hadar. What about the fact that he says that you have to tie up the lulav? Isn't that because we want it to be beautiful and sort of uniform? And we say, no, it has nothing to do with being beautiful and uniform. It's a drasha in the pasuk. It says kapos tamarim, so they say kafus, that it has to be tied up. It has nothing to do with hadar. V'loboy hadar. 1 second, is it really true? The Rabbi Yehuda does not require hadar by lulav. Be'otnan, but we learn in a Mishnah. And ogdin es lulav ela b'mino. You only tie up a lulav with its own species, right? Meaning Rabbi Yehuda, of course, requires eged, right? Lulav boy eged. You have to tie together the oshaina. You have to tie together the lulav, the adasim, the aravis. You tie them all together. And Div Rabbi Yehuda says that you have to what? Ein ogdin es lulav ela b'mino Div Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that when you tie together the oshaina, when you tie together the lulav, adasim, and aravos, you have to tie it together with its own min, with its own species. You can't, use like a rope or something to tie it together. You have to use, right? Of course, we use like, a strip from the lulav. So my time, hadar, is it not because we need it to be beautiful and using just random rope wouldn't be particularly beautiful? Lo. And where it says, no, nothing to do with beautiful. Rava, because after all, Rava says, you could, for the eged, for tying the hushaina together, you can even use ivy that grows on the palm tree. You could even use the like bark of the trunk of the palm tree. It doesn't have to fit in. It doesn't have to be particularly beautiful. It just has to be part of this the same min. It just has to be part of like a palm tree, even though it might not be particularly beautiful. But at my time in Rabbi Yehuda, and how come Rabbi Yehuda says that you have to use specifically the same species if it doesn't have to be particularly beautiful? So awesome, right? Rabbi Yehuda awesome the kasavar, because Rabbi Yehuda holds lulav tzarich eged, because Rabbi Yehuda says that it's a requirement, it's a mitzvah to tie up the hoshaina. And if you bring a separate min that isn't part of the palm tree, well then it would be like you're adding something to the arba, the daled minim, and of course we need 4, not 5, right? So since according to Rabbi Yehuda, tying together the hoshaina is a mitzvah in its own right, if you were to use something that's not one of the 4 species to tie it up, it's like you're introducing a 5th species into the mitzvah, and that would be baltosif, adding on, and that's not acceptable. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says that it would have to be the same min so that it's not baltosif, but once it's the same min, it could be ivy, it could be, bark from the trunk, and even though it's not particularly beautiful, so it has nothing to do with beautiful, it has to do with the mitzvah of eged. Okay, so we see that Rabbi Yehuda does not require hadar when it comes to lulav, but Rava says when it comes to esrig, everyone agrees that it has to be beautiful, because after all, the pasuk says, creates hadar. It has to be a beautiful fruit. Rabbi Yehuda hadar. 1 second. Is that true? Does Rabbi Yehuda really require that an esrig be beautiful? We learn in a brayso, the 4 species in the lulav, man, just like you don't bring less than 4 kachin mosifin alei, and you don't add on to them to make a 5th or more. Lo matzeh esrig, if you don't find an esrig, lo yavi lo parish, don't bring a quince, v'lo rimin, or a lemon, a pomegranate, v'lo davar acher, not some other Indian. Kmushin ksherin, if the esrig is, let's say this. If it's withered a shtickle, it's kosher, yivation, psulin. If it's mamash dried out, it's possible. Rabbi Yehuda omer af yivation. Rabbi Yehuda says you can even use mamash dried out. Dried out what? I don't know. Well, let's go weiter. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda, maise bivnei krachin. There was a story with people in the cities. Now, of course, there aren't like orchards and stuff in the cities. That's more of like a village thing. So they didn't necessarily have orchards. They didn't have access to lulavs. Although usually in the cities, that's where you have access to more things, because that's where all the business is happening. But Akoponim, there was a story with the people in a certain city. They would mamish inherit their lulav for one generation to the next. They didn't have access to lulavs. They didn't live by palm trees. Mamish, one generation to the next, they would give their lulav. Obviously, it would get dried out. They said to Rabbi Yehuda, that's not a proof to say that a lulav could be dried out, because that was an extenuating circumstances. Is that like the thing? Right, it was a shas adchak, right? A difficult situation. That's why they said, okay, fine, you could inherit your lulav even though it's dried out, but that wouldn't be the sort of halacha to say that you can use in general a dried out lulav. Katani miyas Rabbi Yehuda Omer. So what do we see in that price? It says Rabbi Yehuda Af Yeveshin Ksherim, that even dried out ones are kosher. Now we want to assume that what it means is dried out esrogs, right? Because it was talking about we're talking about esrogs, right? If you don't find an esrog, don't bring a quince or a pomegranate. Kemushin Ksherim Yeveshin Psulin Rabbi Yehuda Omer Af Yeveshin. So we want to say what this means, that if the esrog is withered, it's kosher. If it's dried out, it's possible. Rabbi Yehuda says even if it's dried out. So we want to say that it's talking about the esrog. Lo alulav. The Gemara says no, it's not talking about the esrog, it's talking about the lulav. That Rabbi Yehuda is saying if the lulav is dried out, so then it's acceptable. And then he brings a proof about lulavs, that there was a story with the in the city that they would inherit their lulav from one generation to the next. So it's talking about lulav, but esrog would have to be hadar because the pasuk says creates hadar. Amar Mar, we said earlier, kshem shem pochas and mein kachim osifan alein. Just like we don't have less than 4 species, we also don't have more than 4 species. It's not allowed. Pshita, that's obvious. Well, I may have thought to say that since Rabbi Yehuda holds that you have to bind together the Hoshaina, you have to bind together the lulav, the adasim, the rabos. So I might think, I would think if I bring an extra min, they're separate. Meaning, since Rabbi Yehuda says that you have to bundle together the lulav, the adasim, the rabos, if I bring some other species, I don't know, what should I bring? What's an example? Who can give me an example? I don't know. Zatar. I take zatar also, I put it in the bundle. So I would say that since the lulav, the adasim, and the ravis are tied together, and then you have the zatar outside of that, I might think that the zatar isn't necessarily baltosif. It's separate. This is my hoshaina, and this is my zatar. I don't know why it's here, but it is. Right? So I might think that it's not necessarily about Tosef since it's not bundled together with the rest, right? It's clear that the lulav, adasim, the rabos is the mitzvah and this zatar is separate. So Kamash Milan, that no. You even can't do, even according to Rabbi Yehuda says that you would bind together the lulav, adasim, and the rabos, still you can't bring an additional species, it would be about Tosef. Fine. Omer Mai, we said earlier, lo motza esrig, if you didn't find an esrig, lo yavi lo rimam v'lo parish v'lo davar acher, don't bring a pomegranate, don't bring a quince, don't bring anything else. Pshita, this is obvious. Right? The mitzvah is with an esrig, not with a quince or a pomegranate. Ma'odetema laisi, ki'echid v'lo tishkach toris esrig. Well, I may have had the habit to say, in the event that you can't find an esrig, yeah, bring a pomegranate, so that you shouldn't forget that there's a 4th species that we bring. Because if there's no esrog and we just leave it out, so I might think that if I just leave it out, I might forget about esrog bichlal. So maybe I should bring a pomegranate. Kamash malon. Therefore, what the Brisa is saying, no, don't bring a pomegranate because zimnin denafik churva minei dasi lemisrach. Well, it can end up being worse, which is that people will start thinking, oh, you can use pomegranate. It's funny, I'm just thinking now, it's like almost like for maror we use horseradish. I don't know, like why did we start using horseradish? Isn't it romaine lettuce? But I guess at a certain point, maybe I don't know, maybe I'm making this up, but like they didn't have romaine lettuce, they had horseradish, they started using horseradish, and to this very day, people still use horseradish. Even though it should be romaine lettuce. I don't know, maybe I'm like off on that. But the point is, if there are no esrogs, so people start bringing pomegranates, they might just continually bring pomegranates. So because we don't want that to happen, we said, look, if there's no esrog, just don't bring anything at all. Tashma Komenir, esrog ayoshon pasul. An old esrog is pasul. Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Yehuda says it's taka kosher. So Rabbi Yehuda says an old esrog is kosher tiyufta d'Rava tiyufta. That's a kasha and Rava. Because Rava had said earlier in our, right when we started talking about lulav and esrog, Rava said that when it comes to lulav, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require hadar, but when it comes to esrog, he certainly does. Because it says pri'etz hadar. Says this brisa, esrog ayoshan pasul, an old esrog is pasul. I think it's actually a girsa change that even says yavish. Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Yehuda says it's taka kosher, which means that clearly Rabbi Yehuda does not hold of hadar when it comes to esrog. So the Gemara is later going to ask, what do you mean? I thought the pasuk says pri'etz hadar. Okay, we'll get there. Tufta d'Rava tufta, so it's a kasha and Rava, who says that everyone agrees, both Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim agree, that an esrog would need to be hadar, to have hiddur mitzvah by an esrog. Well, apparently, that's not the case, because Rabbi Yehuda says that a dried out esrog is kosher. One second. Does Rabbi Yehuda really not require hadar when it comes to esrig? We learn in the Mishnah, if you have an esrig that is as green as a leek, Reb Meir machshir, Reb Yehuda posel. Reb Meir says it's a kosher esrig. It's green as a leek. It's a kosher esrig. Reb Yehuda says it's a posel esrig. Is it not because Reb Yehuda requires that the esrig needs to be beautiful, and if it's too green, it's not going to be beautiful? Lo. No, it's because if the esrog is too green, if it's as green as a leek, it's not ripe yet. So therefore it's not kosher. It has nothing to do with hadar. Tashma near shir esrog ka'in. What's the minimum size of an esrog? Reb Meir omer ke'egos. Reb Meir says the size of a nut. Reb Yehuda omer kibeya. And Reb Yehuda says it's the size of an egg. So why does Reb Yehuda say that the minimum size of an esrog is the size of an egg? Is it not because Reb Yehuda says that would be considered beautiful? Lo, again, if it's less than the size of an egg, Reb Yehuda would say it's not fully ripe. Tashma, come in here. Reb Yehuda says that the largest size of an esrog is that you could fit two in one hand. If you can't fit two in one hand, if it's too large that you cannot fit two of them in one hand, it's too big, you can't use it. Rabbi Yossi says you can even have, it can be so big that you can even have one esrog in both hands. That, it takes two hands to hold this esrog. My timer, how come Rabbi Yehuda says that the largest shear of an esrog is two in one hand? Is not because that's what's considered beautiful? Lo. It's because since Rabbah says lulav b'yamin v'esrog b'small, that you hold the hoshaina in your right hand and the esrog in your left hand. What if somehow your hoshaina is in your left hand and your esrog is in your right hand, and now you have to switch it? Well, if you use if the esrog is too big to the extent that you can't hold two of them in one hand, well then you won't be able to. How are you going to switch? If the esrog is the size that you can hold two in one hand, so then you'll be able to basically switch. If you have the hoshaina in your left hand and the esrog in your right hand, it's easy to switch them. But let's say you're like Rabbi Yossi on the other extreme, that you have to hold the esrog with two hands. Well, then how are you going to switch the lulav and the esrog? And it might fall on the floor and break. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says that the maximum size of an esrog is that you can hold two of them in one hand, and that way, in the event that you have to switch hands or anything like that, you don't have to worry about anything falling or becoming possible. So again, given the Amar Rabbah, since Rabbah says lulav b'yamin v'esrog b'small, that you hold the hoshaina in your right hand and the esrog in your left hand. Zimrin d'mechalfilei. So what if it's vice versa and you have to switch them? V'asi la'afukinu, v'asi livsule, and you might drop the esrog and it'll become possible. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says that the maximum size is two in one hand, but nothing to do with hadar. Rabbi Yehuda, haksiv hadar. But one second, Rabbi Yehuda, how could you not hold of hadar when it comes to esrog? The pasuk says creates hadar. It has to be a beautiful fruit. Listen to this, friends. Hahu hadar bi'ilanu mishana l'shana. He makes a drasha. Hadar doesn't mean hadar as in hider mitzvah, as in beautiful. It means hadar, that it lives. It has to be a fruit that lives in the tree from one year to the next. In esrog, a citron, lives on, the fruit could stay on the tree from year to year. I don't know for how long exactly, but for over a year, it could stay on the tree. And therefore, so what is the Pri Eitz Hadar? What is the esrog? It's takin esrog. It's a citron, because a citron is a pri that's hadar bilanu mishana l'shana, that lives on a tree from one year to the next. So hadar, according to Rabbi Yehuda, has nothing to do with hider mitzvah. It has to do with hadar bilanu mishana l'shana, i.e., that we're talking over here about a citron. Wow. The Mishnah had said that a lulav from an Asherah tree, a lulav that comes from a palm tree that was worshipped for avodah zarah, you can't use it. Is that really true? Why can't you use it? Meaning, if you have a tree that was worshipped as avodah zarah, what's the problem with it? The problem is that avodah zarah is asur ba'ano. Okay, the mitzvahs lav le'anus ninu. The mitzvahs weren't given so that we can benefit from them. We do the mitzvahs because we have to do the mitzvahs. It has nothing to do with getting pleasure and enjoyment from the mitzvahs. And therefore, technically speaking, says Rava, Right? But Rava says lulav shel avodah zarah lo yitovim not kosher. A lulav of avodah zarah you shouldn't use, but if you did, l'maisa it's kosher because mitzvahs lav le'anos ninu. You're not. Meaning the problem with avodah zarah is it's asur ba'ano, but you're not getting hanoah from it. You're not getting pleasure from it, benefit from it, because it's mitzvahs lav le'anos ninu. Right? Using it for mitzvah, mitzvahs aren't about getting benefit. So why is the Mishnah saying that the lulav of an asherah that comes from a tree that was worshipped for avodah zarah is possible? Why should it be possible? It's not l'chatchila, but it shouldn't be possible. So the Gemara answers, what kind of asherah tree are we talking about? An asherah of Moshe Rabbeinu, that it says in Sefer Devarim, it says, "V'ashereim tisrufun bo'esh," that when we go into Eretz Yisrael, any trees that were worshipped for avodah zarah, we have to mamish burn. That's what it says. Any asherah that we find, we have to burn. And because it's condemned to be burnt, it's as if it already doesn't exist. Meaning we have to burn it anyway. So technically it's still standing right now, but, it's basically, as far as we're concerned, it's basically burned. It's just, missing the actual step of burning it. But as far as we're concerned, it's as though it's already burnt and it doesn't exist. And since it doesn't exist, it doesn't have an amount. And as we said in our Mishnah, that a lulav needs to be 4 tvachim. And if it comes from an asherah tree, an asherah of Moshe that needs to be burnt, and therefore it's as if it doesn't even exist anymore, so then clearly it doesn't have a size if it doesn't exist, and therefore it's not 4 tvachim, and we need it to be 4 tvachim. Dekanami, you can also infer this, that if we look in the Mishnah, it says shel asherah v'shel ir anidachas, that we have asherah listed right next to ir anidachas, just like ir anidachas. The issue with using a lulav from an ir nidachas is that same very thing, that in ir nidachas, which is a city that most of the inhabitants were idol worshippers, so you have to kill all the people, burn all the things in it, and therefore any palm tree that was in that city would be considered like non-existent, and therefore it doesn't have any size to it, and it needs to be 4 tvachim, and this is 0 tvachim because it's non-existent. So we see that the asherah is just like the Nidachas. They're both talking about where they don't exist, so it must be talking about an asherah of Moshe. But as Rava points out, in avodah zarah lulav, technically speaking, if you used it, it would work because while it's asur ba'ano, you're not getting anoah because mitzvah slav le'onos nitnu cheved. That was daf lamed aleph of Masechta Sukkah. The daf began talking about a stolen sukkah. And we had two kinds of stolen sukkahs that the Gemara discussed. One type of stolen sukkah is that Reuven goes onto Shimon's property and throws Shimon out of his sukkah and hijacks it. So in that case, Rabbi Eliezer says that it's possible because Mimon Avshach, if karka is nigzelis, well then it's a sukkah gzula. If karka ain't a nigzelis, it's a sukkah she'ula. And Rabbi Eliezer says you're not allowed to use a sukkah she'ula. The Chacham's opinion is that it's a kosher sukkah because technically karka ain't a nigzelis, so it's still Shimon's, and Reuven's essentially forcibly borrowing Shimon's sukkah. And a borrowed sukkah is a kosher sukkah. However, if you would steal wood and construct it into your sukkah, well then you would just give the value of the wood that you stole because of what's called takanas hashavim, which is that in order to encourage somebody to do tshuva, we don't make him destroy the sukkah to return the wood. We just say pay the value of it. Then we got into the sugya of hadar. First, in the context of lulav, we said that according to the Chachamim, a lulav would have to be hadar, beautiful. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we do not compare lulav to esrog. Although that's actually taka interesting, because if the whole point was that we don't compare lulav to esrog, we ended up saying that esrog in the end, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold of hadar anyways. But therefore, I guess, okay, he doesn't hold of hadar by lulav, and he doesn't hold of hadar by esrog. He also memela doesn't hold of it by lulav. So therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda that you don't need hadar in the context of lulav. The rabbi said that we do compare lulav to esrog, and just like esrog, you need hadar, also by lulav you need hadar. Now, we initially wanted to assume that according to everybody, however, you would need hadar by esrog, but as we proved, actually, Rabbi Yehuda holds that by esrog you do not need hadar. So what does it do with pre-eitz hadar? It means hadar be'ilanu mishana l'shana, that it's a fruit that lives in the tree from one year to the next, i.e. in esrog, a citron. We saw some interesting halachis along the way towards the end there about esrog. We saw a machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda about a green esrog. If it's as green as a leek, Reb Meir says that it is a kosher esrog. Reb Yehuda says it's a pasul esrog because it's not yet ripe. We also talked about the minimum size of a esrog. Reb Meir, once again, right? So Reb Meir says that the minimum size is the size of a nut. Reb Yehuda says the minimum size is the size of an egg. And then we talked about the maximum size of an esrog. Reb Yehuda says that it's enough, right? That the maximum size that you can hold 2 in one hand. Reb Yossi says you can even hold 1 in 2 hands. We then discussed a lulav of avodah zarah. We said, it says Rava points out that if we're talking about actual avodah zarah itself, well, avodah zarah is also bana, so you shouldn't use a lulav of avodah zarah, but technically if you did, you are yotze because mitzvos lav leonos nitnu, and it's not considered like you're getting benefit from avodah zarah. When the Mishnah says that an Asherah tree, a tree that was worshipped for avodah zarah, is possible, it's talking about an Asherah of Moshe, that when the Yidden went into Eretz Yisrael, they had to burn all the Asherah trees, and therefore it's as if it's condemned and it has no, it's as if it's basically destroyed already, and therefore it has no shi'ur, no measure, no amount, no size, and we need a lulav to be 4 tfachim, and this is 0 tfachim because it's condemned, and therefore, and that is just like an Ir Nidachas, which is the next thing in the Mishnah, which is a city that's basically condemned, and any palm tree in there wouldn't have any size, and we need 4 tfachim for the lulav. That was Daf Lamed Aleph, Daf 31 of Masechta Sukkah. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you enjoy your day. Cheers.